G'day all, Adam Wuiske here from Wuiske Models again for part 5, albeit a bit late, of the layout that Insanity built. In this one I thought I'd show you what I've been doing over the last few weeks with regards to a bit of track and some of the base work for the scenery and fascias and things like that. So yeah, let's talk base scenery and track. Okay, so for this one we thought we'd take you through and show you a bit of the stuff I've been plodding away on over the last couple of weeks in my absence. So effectively, as you can see, the painting's been done by my darling wife Bridget, so it's come up really well, so that's good. The ceiling's now about 75-80% done. It's very nearly finished, so I've been sidetracked building an office because, well, I had to clear the space. But from there, I've started working a bit more on fascias and starting to get the base level for terrain in. Now, what I'm doing for terrain is something that I've done many times over on previous layouts. Initially, I used to use chicken wire, and I used to screw it and nail it and all sorts of stuff to the formwork to get it to take the basic terrain and then put plaster bandage over the top. Now, bottom line is chicken wire is a pain in the backside to work with. So what I've gone through from there is to the tried and true and 10,000-year-old method, cardboard strips. So if you have a look just around me, you'll start to see some funny little bits of timber and things like that sitting around, which effectively, I think I mentioned in one of the previous videos, one of the big things for me that you see on a lot of layouts is undulations in terrain. And there's a lot of layouts where everything is flat, wherever there's a building and stuff like that. Well, the real world just ain't like that. Sorry, flat earthers. So what I've been doing is, as I say, we've got the track bed here is raised up from the benchwork. And that allows me to have terrain going above and below the roadbed. Now, as a process of that, we've got bridges and everything else to go with it, and I've got bases that I've put in to create a flat base for a building. So once I build these buildings, I can put them in position and the landforms can be built around it. Now, whether that means that they're running below it or above it, they can run right up against it. So imagine when you see a building that, you know, it might be 2 stories high at one end, but then there's a basement level starting to stick out. That's the sort of thing we're going for. So just as a for instance with what I'm trying to explain with the way that we're doing the bases for the buildings and everything else, I've got 2 little videos that I shot. One that was shot about 2 weeks ago and one that was shot today, just showing the difference over that 2-week period of what we're trying to do to start with, how it looks, it's pretty basic, and then what we're aiming for, which brings us up to a level where we're actually ready for plaster bandage.
So this is going to look pretty ordinary because if you remember from last episode, I said we are in the abyss here. It's pretty dark. So this is what's going to be the 4X brewery. So all the track is now in, barring some buffer stops at the end. So that'll just be background buildings with something coming out over the top, bit of a shed. And then we continue up here. We've got all the track in for Patterson Station, which is loosely based on Milton in Brisbane, and then we keep coming up the gradient. So once the terrain's in here, it'll start to make a lot more sense. We've got another station here, which is just a simple island platform station heading into a cutting, and then as you can see here, I've got a base built in. That building won't actually be there. It's just to give me a rough idea of how it's going to look. But yeah, all we're doing is just marking little bits out of 6mm MDF for the bases for buildings to give us a flat platform to mount them on. And then I've used just an offcut of yellow tongue, just screwed to the frame to support it and keep it level. And then we start coming down grade. And then we've got a road bridge here. These bridge abutments are actually woodlands. Sorry, not woodlands, they're walthers. So just a cast urethane abutment. And then we come around, you can see I've got another platform here for a house. And then we come into Daly Station, which is starting to take shape. And I think we're going to call it black and blue packaging is the industry along here. And then that's the end of the track work thus far, and still about another 25 feet to go down to the end. Okay, so here we are just down from the abyss at Patterson, and if we head up, you'll start to see some unpainted fascia, which is all the new stuff. And you can see right here there'll be a road bridge going underneath, or road going under. And you can start to see that we go into a cutting, and then we come out. Now this flat portion here will have a dead-end street coming off the edge of the layout, and there'll be a house on either side of it. So then as the land sort of comes back up again, we start to get into the platform for a station that's as yet unnamed. But as you can see, it's sitting in a cutting that's slowly getting taller. And then we come up here to a road bridge, which is based loosely on Swan Road at Taringa. And then it's a cutting coming underneath with, as you can see, there's a straight section there. That's actually the access road, which is there in real life. And so that'll be just a dirt track for the railway workers to get down if they need to get into the track, which is another element that people don't seem to model. But as you can see, there's a platform there for one building. That's not the building that's going there, but it's the one that's sitting there just to give me an idea. And then there's another one here. And then it comes back down. There's the access road as well. And then we have a road covered in cardboard strips. And then right here on the fascia, we've got a street that will basically edge itself off the front of the layout. And then here we have a platform for a small townhouse or something like that. And then I've got more cardboard strips and a platform for a house, which will have a driveway running up. And then there'll be a level crossing about where the W on the Walthers box is. So the driveway will go to that.
So I've got some photos that I'll show of this as I was putting in the bases and how I've done it. It's pretty basic. Effectively, I just used MDF that I had, and I just made some little rough blocks to mount them on and just attacked them with something. Glue, nails, screws, prayer power, the whole lot to get them stuck to the wall. And I just used a small spirit level just to make sure it was level. So as well as that, I've also been putting in the bases for what's going to be roads and streets. So this here is just a piece of MDF that's been screwed in at one end, and then there's blocks at the other where it's been mounted on that end. Now from there, the next step is I'm using a trusty hot glue gun. By the way, I hate hot glue guns, but geez, they work. And all I do is just put a bit of hot glue on one end, try and avoid my fingers. I never succeed, but I try. Stick it on, and then once it's set, I just bend it into the profile I want and glue the other end. And there's your terrain. So the next bit from there is there's only certain bits you can actually do with that. The next step you need from there is you need your fascias in. Now the fascias for this entire layout are done with 3mm MDF. It's cheap, it's cheerful, and it's really nice to work with. You can just rip it down with a jigsaw and it leaves a nice clean edge. So for the fascias, this bit right next to me that's unpainted. So if you have a look in the photo, everything that's not painted black, I did all of that in about 2.5 hours. That's 38 feet of fascia, just 3mm MDF, just mark it and clamp it in position, draw the outline of where I want the terrain, take it away and cut it with the jigsaw, and then come back, re-clamp it, and then I've come in with my trusty nail gun and just hit it with some cheap brads. So the next step along from that was to put in more of the cardboard strips. Now I've put them in a lattice work fashion, so they're running across the layout framework and all glued. And then after that, I've actually woven them in between the horizontal pieces, just so that we've got a bit of an open web, so that I've got a nice firm base to stick my plaster bandage. So now, using plaster bandage, this is something that people either like it or they hate it. You know, my first layout I did when I was about 10-year-old, I did with paper mache. And then over the top of that, I ended up putting plaster. Now, I've got to tell you straight out, I don't much like working with plaster. It's messy, and I'm always worried I'm going to get the mixture wrong. So, rightio. But you get there in the end. Now, so far as plaster bandage, when I was building, well, 2 layouts ago, I started getting a bit annoyed because I was buying a certain brand that I shan't name, that we all know, and it got pretty expensive. Now, based on the type of business we run, we actually deal with a medical wholesaler. Now, I started buying it off them for about 2/3 of the price. So that was all great, and it was medical grade bandage, which meant it was a lot tougher and it actually had more plaster in it. So it was a lot easier and quicker to apply. But after a while of using it and going through about 130 odd bags, or packages of it, I decided, you know what, bugger it, why don't I just make it? So we did. Wuiske Models Plaster Bandage. Insert shameless plug here. Now, the reason I did this is that it's plaster bandage, right? You've got good stuff, you've got mediocre stuff, and you've got awful stuff. Now, what I went for was a medical grade plaster bandage because, from my experience, it worked better than the cheaper stuff. And on top of that, I made sure that at the going price in Australia at the time, ours was the exact same price, but you got twice as much, because I just got annoyed with paying so much money for it for something that was going to be covered up. So that's why we started doing plaster bandage, and without trying to toot my own horn, I'm really happy with it. I'm very glad I did it. Now, whilst we're talking about the bases of scenery and everything else, one of the other things I've allowed for, as I mentioned, roads, but I've also got a couple of road bridges going in. Now, what I've done with those is I've used just 3 or 6 mil MDF, depending what took me fancy for what type of bridge it was, and I've had wooden blocks that I've placed in position, and then I've just either screwed them or glued them onto that. Now, the way I've done it is, this was actually a suggestion from young Maddie, was to measure them off Google Earth. Now, I know I did mention we were going to talk about track. Now, as I've mentioned before, we've been using the Wuiske Models track because this is a narrow gauge layout, and there's only really 1 or 2 suppliers on the planet worth talking about for track. Hopefully I'm one of them, but that's another story. Now, we manufacture a fine scale, narrow gauge HON 3.5, or HOM if you're European, track. It represents metre gauge or 3'6", which is what we're doing. Now, we made it purely and simply because during the COVID lockdowns and everything else, there was massive problems with getting enough. And as I've mentioned in the past, we looked at the cost of producing it versus what we're going to need for this monstrosity. And we thought, why not? So just to give you a quick overview of how I lay the track, it's pretty simple. Now, I've seen some really good ways of laying track and some pretty horrendous ones. My favourite one was a guy using thumbtacks to put his track down, which, yeah, okay, enough said. But all I do, as I've mentioned in the past, is I cut my cork strips to the width I want. I have a line that I've marked with a fancy little Sharpie. I run a bead of Aquateer or PVA glue along it, and then I just press it down, and I usually put some weights on it in the form of blocks of wood or whatever, just to let it sit. Now, sometimes you will get little bits that bubble up on curves. I just cut them out once it's dry. Now, once your cork's down, the next step beyond that is to start laying your track. Now, for all of my track, all I do is, again, I run a bead of PVA glue, and then I use a high-tech piece of cardboard. It's actually a bit of cardboard off the rail joiners packet that I got. And all I do is I just smear that gently across the top, and all that does is just break the bead and just smooth it out a little bit, and you just press your track into it. Now, once the track's pressed in, I just go with a high-tech thing, which is a bunch of Tamiya spray tins, and I put that over the track. If it's a straight stretch of track, I use bigger tins. They weigh more, right? And just let it sit like that. But always run your eyeball along it, and you'll find any little kinks and undulations, and you can sort of work them out. Now, I've still got a couple of little kinks and twists in this, but bit by bit, we're getting rid of them. Now, whilst I'm laying the track, I'm always planning ahead as well. So if you go through this layout, you'll actually see little drawings of signals everywhere. And the reason I've done that is because I'm planning on putting in occupancy detection and block detection. And because on a layout this size, you really need signals. It's a must. So for the signalling, what I'm doing to allow for that is the back rail is what I'm calling the common rail. So it'll have your normal power going to it. The front rail is the one where it has a gap. Now, for the gap, as I've mentioned in the past, the thing I'm most paranoid about is movement. So what I'm using is insulated rail joiners. They're cheap and cheerful and easy to get hold of. So effectively what I've got is an insulated rail joiner everywhere that I'm planning on having a new block or a signal. Now, with that, the thing you've got to bear in mind is how long your train's going to be. Because unless you've got a caboose or a guard's van on the back with lights or something drawing current in it, you could end up with a train that's actually occupying 2 or 3 blocks, but the signal with a caboose or a guard's van stuck in it is going to be showing green. So a simple way around that is to have lights in your guards vans or whatever's going at the back of your train, flashing rear end devices or anything like that on your last vehicle, which can be a bit problematic so far as switching and all the rest of that. But if you allow for this sort of thing, or keep your blocks longer than your longest train. So on this layout, the longest trains I'm planning on running are 4 meters long, or about 14 feet. So we're trying to keep the blocks at that length or greater. Now, for some parts, that will be a bit of an issue, but we think we can muddle our way through it. We shall see how we go. So now when we get to points or turnouts, there's your next issue. I get probably at least one email a week from people asking me, how do you do it? Because it seems to be one of these dark arts or something that's missing, right? It's something people get confused by. I'll tell you now, it's really simple. Because I'm working in narrow gauge, there's only so many different brands of points or turnouts available. Now, the ones I'm using, that I'm planning on doing handmade ones using fast track jigs, but that's another story for another chapter. But in the meantime, I'm using Pico points. Now, with those ones, in narrow gauge, they're Electrofrog. You've got Electrofrog and Insulfrog. Don't believe me? Have a look. So the basic difference between Electrofrog and Insulfrog is on Insulfrog points, which are the ones you get with train sets and things like that, usually your cheaper ones, the actual frog on the point, or the turnout, is usually part of a plastic piece. Now, that acts as an insulator to stop the current jumping across and creating a short circuit. With Electrofrog points, it's all metal and there's actually wires hidden into them or cast into them to actually create conductivity between all the pieces of rail. Now, the easy way to get around this as a problem for wiring, because it does create a short, your left rail and your right rail do end up becoming one. Now, the easiest way to avoid that short is the 2 rails at the center of the end of your turnout, where you've got 4 rails, the 2 in the middle, put an insulated joiner on both of them. That solves the problem very quickly, very simply, and it's done. So with every point or turnout that I've got, I'm planning on having a point motor. Now, in an ideal world, I'll be playing with these new shiny servo motor things, but you get that. We'll see how we go, because that's a bridge I haven't jumped off yet. So for some of them, I will be using the DCC Concepts, Cobalt, IP, Digitals, whatever they're called. I used them on my last layout and I quite liked them. They were simple, not cheap, but they were simple. But I've still got a heap of them. Now, they're very similar in a way to the Tortoise turnout motors, but they've got a digital decoder built into them. The thing I really like about the DCC Concepts one is they've got all these spots underneath them for just plugging wires in. You don't need to solder them. But as well as that, the third slot, you have a wire that comes down from your frog and goes straight into the third slot, which means you're no longer relying on the current to jump from the stock rail to the switch rail, which is always a problem. And once you start trying to clean up those, you will never stop. But with these sorts of point motors, or you can do the same with a frog juicer and all sorts of other products out there, right? It eliminates that problem. It's got its own current going into it, and it changes polarity as the points change, which means your locomotives will run across that set of points smoothly, cleanly, and without interruption or stalling every time. Now, the one last thing I'll say at this point on point motors and all of that is what I personally do is I drill a 3mm hole underneath where the frog is going so I can run the wire through, and I also drill a 10mm hole underneath where the point motor itself is going so that the wire has plenty of space where it can move and throw the switch rails. So that pretty much wraps up all I'm going to say at the moment about turnouts. Oh, sorry, one other thing. When you're laying turnouts, that's fine, that's easy, it's just a piece of fairly rigid track. But when you're laying your track into it from all 3 directions, just eyeball it. Make sure you've got a good 6 inches that lines up with the turnout, that lines up with the straight, the whole box and dice. That'll be your biggest problem. And if you get movement, like I did in previous layouts, it will be a nightmare. Now that's all well and good to say, but the reality is it doesn't actually take much effort. Just a bit of common sense and just, as I said, get your eyeball down on the track and just line it up. You'll see it immediately. But the same thing goes for double slips and single slips and diamond crossings. Always line them up. You do the same thing with your track when you're laying flex track, so why not do it for your turnouts and your crossings? So hopefully you enjoyed that and you got something from it. But in the next one, I think we will basically be starting to lay plaster bandage, and we'll be going through that. And then on top of that, we'll be starting to do wiring. I hate wiring, but no, I just hate wiring. It's a good thing I haven't got much of it to do, eh? But the thing is that we're going to be running the dropper wires and everything else, and in theory I should actually have enough stuff here that I might be able to get this bit of track, well, the 60 odd feet of it going that way, running. We'll see how we go. But thanks heaps for watching. If you've made it through to the end, good on you. You've got less of a life than I do. But that's another story entirely, right? But thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm sorry that there was a delay, but we'll see how we go. And in the next one, we might look at plaster bandage and starting on putting in the dropper wires.